Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening. And I strayed away all this time from saying good evening because sometimes, I'm waiting for people to answer and that. But anyways, okay, our winter-spring portion of the Thursday evening speaker series will be coming to an end with a break through the summer, planning, God willing, to resume in the fall. Once again, we would like to thank Father Miran for bringing good, quality speakers to our church, providing for us the opportunity to enrich our lives. We appreciate that. Tonight, we are fortunate to once again have Father Elias Grafai as our speaker. His talk is titled Constantinopolitan Christianity, It's All Greek to Me. Please welcome Father Elias.
Thank you. It's good to be back. It seems like I was here only 2 weeks ago. That's true. It was 2 weeks ago. The topic that we're going to look at is actually, I think it's a pretty interesting topic for many reasons because it does speak to identity. As Byzantine Catholics, so we have a definite connection to Byzantine heritage. And so what is that? Where does that term come from? And secondly, this is the anniversary year of a very well-known and famous document that was signed in the city of Milan that legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire in the year 313. And basically that is really where most of the things that we know for certain about Christian history began. Because Christians were no longer persecuted and things began to change. And that year also marks the beginning of the building up of many of the basilicas and churches in the city of Rome and in other places. So it's a very important year indeed. And so what we're going to do is look a little bit in general at some of this ancient history. And then we're going to look in particular at the lives of two very pivotal figures from this period. You've all heard, I'm sure you've heard the word Greek Catholic. And we used to be known as Greek Catholics, and in some countries that term is still commonly used. And it was a term that had to do with two realities. One with a legal entity name within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because since our ancestors from the year 1646 were no longer Orthodox, but in that year our leaders signed a union with Rome in the city of Ushhorod. So we had to kind of change our name. And so we received that name of Greek Catholic as opposed to Roman Catholic. And the idea was that as Roman Catholics are connected to the spiritual heritage of the city of Rome, so that doesn't mean that they're necessarily Italian, although some could be, but Roman Catholics mean that they're spiritual children of the city of Rome. So Greek Catholics are spiritual children of the city of Constantinople, which was the Greek city, or the Greek capital of the Roman Empire. And it was a lot easier to say Greek Catholic instead of saying Constantinopolitan Catholic. So that was, I think, another reason why we opted for Greek. And of course, when our ancestors immigrated to this country, they found that there were a number of different peoples who also called themselves Greek Catholic. And those people came from the Ottoman Empire. They were of Arabic background from the Middle East, as well as other Greek Catholics who came from the area which is today the Ukraine. And so they found out they weren't alone with that title of Greek Catholic. And to make it more complicated, many of our ancestors came in contact for the very first time with actual people who were Greek, who spoke Greek. And we weren't Greek, we were Slav. So there was, because of that reason, our leaders, our church leaders, began to move away from that title of Greek Catholic, since it belonged more to the people who appropriately came from Greece and speak Greek, to move away to the title of Byzantine. Because the city of Constantinople was founded on what was originally the small port town of Byzantion, and the Christian empire founded there by Constantine, or that Christian city founded by Constantine, gave birth to the Byzantine Empire. So Byzantium, Byzantine Christianity was more appropriate, and it was non-ethnic. Now, of course, the problem arises that would the fathers of the church, even St. Cyril and Methodius, if they were to hear us referring to ourselves as Byzantines or Byzantine Christians or Byzantine Catholics, they would not be very happy, because the word Byzantine means pre-Christian, so pagan. So it's still a little mixed up. We haven't quite worked out all the kinks, but you can be thankful that we're not using the word Constantinopolitan Catholic, because it really doesn't roll off the tongue. But what we are looking at, though, is this early part of our Christian history. And this is a common Christian history, common to all Christians, including Roman Catholics, Western Christians, even those who later became Protestants. It's common to Christians in the Middle East, Christians who are Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox. This is the very roots of our faith. And it's around two specific people. And these people are depicted in icons in your parish church. Saint Constantine and his mother, Saint Helena. And they are given a specific title in our church. They are called equals to the apostles, because of what they did to spread Christianity throughout the Mediterranean world, and also what they did to bring about the Christianization of the Roman Empire. But we have to begin somewhere, and so we'll begin a little bit with talking about the situation of the Roman Empire. From the time of Jesus' ascension to heaven, Pentecost, the Christians going out into the world, the Roman Empire began a certain period of decline. And one of the big issues was that everything was becoming kind of muddled. There wasn't a clear Roman identity, but as the Roman Empire grew, it included Egyptians and Jews and Syro-Aramaic peoples, and then Gauls and Celts and all the different tribes that became a part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire began to lose a primary identity that was Latin, Roman, or Greek. And one of the ways that the Roman emperors tried to include all of these different peoples was to bring their religious culture to the capital city, to the city of Rome. And so Rome itself became kind of a melting pot of different religions. And it became a city that was, very mixed up, very eclectic. And spiritually, the Romans became very much, the native Romans became distant from their own religious background. And they kind of picked and chose what they wanted to believe in, kind of a religious buffet. And that was what the city of Rome offered. So as the apostles came and preached, they found a people who were very much hungry for a true spirituality, for a religious identity that promised them something that was real, not just fairy tales or fables. And so the mission of the apostles began with rather great success among the locals, especially the people who had a Greek and Roman background, their own religious identity with the ancient philosophers, found a certain connect with the message of Christ. And also the apostles, when they went out to the ancient Egyptians, they found there a very strong base for Christian faith, because the ancient Egyptians had a very deep belief in the afterlife, the life to come. And so Christianity was very well received there. However, the Roman emperors, they themselves were going through a certain traumatic period. Their bloodline had become watered down, and many military leaders had found their ways into political leadership in the empire. And some of the emperors were, well, pretty crazy. I mean, if you've heard of Caligula and those, they were really basket cases. I mean, nut cases that should have been tied up and sent to the insane asylum. They really had serious problems. Some of that we think is because of inbreeding, because they were actually not healthy in their relationships, and other because of their own ideas about their own divinity, religious ideas, megalomania, and etc., etc. But this also led many of these Roman leaders and emperors to blame the Christians. So when things went wrong, when an emperor had, well, a bad day and things were not working out as he had planned, he would blame it on the Christians. So for example, when the city of Rome burned during the Emperor Nero's period of rule, he blamed it on the Christians, even though he himself, we now know, set the city on fire. This was very common. The Christians were the scapegoats because their faith had taken root. They were well known, and one of the other reasons, they refused to offer sacrifices and tribute to the Roman emperors who considered themselves gods. They also refused to partake of the foods that had been prayed over in the presence of pagan idols in the temples. Because of this, Christians were persecuted, and the opportunities to actually build churches, establish places of worship, and even simple things such as coming together to pray in people's homes were very limited. And again, and there were still many persecutions. The last one actually happening probably towards the beginning of the 4th century, the early 300s under Diocletian. Now, at the same time as the Roman Empire is kind of going downhill, we can go to the next slide, please. We can see there are different reasons for this decline. And some of these reasons I've already mentioned, but one of the things that also influenced the decline of Rome was old politics. Many of the ruling families and the senatorial families in Rome were descendants of other families, and so things kind of imagine the Kennedys, but lasting for 400, 500 years. So you have these families that rule everything, and so it's become very much a limited pool of people who are calling the shots in the empire. And so Diocletian comes into power. Go to the next slide. And he was born around the year 244. He was a military man from a humble family, and he created a kind of a new paradigm. He saw that the Roman Empire, although it was very big, it was also limited because it was being ruled at any given time primarily by one person. And so by the time the emperor could send troops from France to what's today Turkey, Asia Minor could be completely on fire with a rebellion. And so in order to better rule over this land, he decided first of all to create a system of co-emperors. And so he himself was designated as the senior emperor. And then he gave another position to Maximian to be his co-emperor. And later on, because even that system of two was not enough, he further expanded it to another 2 junior emperors. And so it became kind of, if you want to make a little bit of a comparison, it became kind of like the system of the states that we have here in this country, where each region, state, has its own head, would be the governor or one of the co-emperors. And that person would be in charge of taking care of business there. And for federal laws, they would gather together and make those laws together. And Diocletian would be the one who has ultimately the last word, since he is the highest ranking of the emperors. Diocletian himself was not of royal lineage. He was a humble man from a poor family, but he was a great military leader. And because of that, he created this system so that it would make his rule a little better and easier. Next. He created, well, this right here, this is the system. It is called the Tetrarchy. The system of the 4 emperors who ruled the entire empire. The 4 emperors, and this is, if you've been to the city of Venice, this is actually on one of the corners of St. Mark's Basilica. It was originally in the city of Constantinople, where it had been taken from Rome. So it had kind of made the rounds. But eventually, in the 13th century, it found its way to the city of Venice, and there it was an actual depiction of the collaboration of the 4 emperors to run the country. One of these emperors was one of the junior emperors, so the last ones to come on board, was a man named Constantinus Chlorus. And Constantinus Chlorus was also a great military leader. He was recognized by Diocletian as such, and as you can see, there is a trend. All of these emperors, because the earlier emperors had been kind of frivolous leaders who wasted money and enjoyed their time and really didn't do much to build up the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So in this period, at the end of the 3rd century, the Diocletian saw that the only ones he could really depend on were people of a like mind like himself, military leaders. They were organized, they knew structure, they knew how to govern people and keep everything so that it would run smoothly. They ran, of course, with a little bit of a hand, but that was the way that things unfortunately worked out in the Roman Empire. Constantinus Chlorus was one of these military men who was destined to become one of the 4 tetrarchs, one of the junior emperors. And as he was leading a military crusade in Asia Minor, he happened to stay in a small town at an inn. And there at the inn, of course, they had a bar and a restaurant, as most places, most inns do. there was a waitress who came up to him to take his order for whatever he wanted to eat and drink. And he noticed that this waitress had on her hand a bracelet. And it happened to be the same bracelet that he was wearing. Constantinus Chlorus was, well, he's a Roman, so although he's a smart, intelligent military man, he's also very superstitious. And so everything that happens is either some way a sign from the gods or it's some sort of a message for the future. And so when he saw this bracelet on this woman, he decided to begin to talk to her and find out who she was. She was a very attractive young woman. And eventually they were, I guess, married. We're not sure how this all happened, but there was some sort of a common law arrangement. We could say that at least. And this woman, whose name is Helena, she eventually becomes pregnant and she has a son. The son is, admittedly, he is recognized as Constantinus Chlorus' son. But Constantinus Chlorus, because he was on the up and up as far as his career is concerned, it was deemed that he should marry someone who was more of his rank, someone who would be fitting to rule with him as a consort. And so, and this is how we know that there was some sort of an arrangement between him and Helena, because there are documents that show to a divorce. And so there was a divorce that happened between Constantinus Chlorus and Helena. And Helena stayed behind. She stayed in Asia Minor, and eventually she did move. We're not sure why, if she was trying to follow him, but eventually she did move, and in what is today Serbia, in the city of Niš, she gave birth to a child, a boy, named Constantine. She named him after his father. Constantinus Chlorus, though, ended up marrying the daughter of one of the senior, not Diocletian, but Maximian. So, again, to try to keep the politics in the family. It was a way of consolidating power, but it was also a way that eventually they wouldn't turn on each other, because they were all intermarrying somehow. So at least, if not related by blood, related by marriage. Helena, however, did not give up on her son. And so she did begin this journey of trying to use her son's background, the fact that he is the son of one of the tetrarchs. She tried to use that to bring him into a position of some power. Eventually, she herself brought him to the court of Diocletian, so one of the senior emperor in the Roman Empire at the time. And he recognized Constantine as Constantinus' son, and he was raised there. And Constantinus grew up in that court, and it was there that he received his military education and he became a soldier. Next. So Constantine was born around the year 274-75, and we see here, because of Constantinus's rank, he ended up leaving behind Helena and married Theodora, the daughter of Maximian. Constantine, with his mother, ended up in the eastern part of the Roman Empire in the court of Diocletian, who took the young Constantine under his wing. Next. So here we get a little bit of an idea of how how the Roman Empire was divvied up. We're looking, this is around the year 300. And the division of the empire was in 4 parts. So this was one part of the empire, what you see here is purple. The second part of the empire is the pink part, North Africa and most of Italy. The third part is this lavender part in the middle, which is where Greece is today. And the fourth part is all the way from Britain down to Spain, including France. What also happened to change at this time, because of the borders being so essential to keeping the country together, the capital cities, each of these provinces had a capital city. The capital cities were all located closer to border areas. So for the pink part, which would include the city of Rome, Rome was not the capital. The capital was actually Milan. And for the area that is brownish, the British, French, and Spanish part, the capital is the city of Trier in what's today in Germany. And in the lavender section, the capital was the city of Serdica, which is today Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. And in this part, which is the easternmost part, the capital was the city of, where is it? It may actually not be there. But anyway, this is the area though. This is where, in this area, this is where Helena came from. Whereas this is where Constantine was born. And then they returned back here for Constantine to grow up in the court of Diocletian. Next. So Constantine was used by Diocletian, I guess, to a certain degree. This would really make a good movie if you think about it. Constantine was used by Diocletian because even though they were all military men, one of the things that happens when you have a number of very strong military men trying to cooperate is that they get a little greedy or power hungry. And so just in the same way that it was important to establish these marriages that were convenient so that the general would be the father-in-law of another one of the emperors to kind of keep the peace. So in the same way, Diocletian, who was at the end of his reign, he was already sickly and getting older, he saw the raising of Constantine, not in the court of his father, but in his own court, as being a political maneuver. That this way he would be able to control Constantine. And his father, Constantinus Chlorus, who had no part in his upbringing, who really did nothing to contribute to the growth of his son, but nonetheless, because he is his son, would not turn on Diocletian. And in fact, Diocletian entrusted Constantine, because he was an able soldier, with leading many military battles. So much so that word got out to Constantinus Chlorus that his son was quite the gifted military leader. Eventually, now Constantine himself had a son by a relationship with a woman that we know as Minervina, but eventually he was engaged to marry Fausta, and Fausta was the daughter of Maximian, who is the other junior emperor. Next. Eventually, Constantine was summoned to the court of Constantinus Chlorus. And in the year 306, when Constantinus Chlorus died, so Constantine was acclaimed by the troops of Constantinus Chlorus as the next leader. And he came into that position. The Roman Empire and its system of 4 leaders, the Tetrarchy, was really not working out successfully. And again, with the death of the senior emperors, the junior emperors were left to kind of fight it out. And next. And so, after Constantinos' death, Constantine is acclaimed as the Caesar, and he returns to the city of Trier. He calls for his mother Helena to return to court. Helena was, because she was kind of the other woman in this scenario, since she was not the legitimate wife, even though she was the first wife, she was on the outs, and she was never welcomed into the court. And even though Constantine made his way politically through the courts of Rome, Helena was limited. However, Helena was the one who brought up Constantine and obviously instilled in him many of the values that were important to her. At some point in her exile, so before the year 306, we think that she became a Christian. We're not sure when it happened or who did it, which bishop or priest brought the Christian faith to her. But nonetheless, in the traveling that she did, she obviously found Christianity, and she was baptized. When she came back into the court, she exercised a little bit of control over Constantine. Although Constantine was a very astute military leader, he probably had some of the same issues with Christianity that his predecessors did. After all, he didn't know any Christians because Christianity was illegal. And everything that he had learned about Christians, he probably heard from other people, especially the stories that blame the Christians for many of the problems of the Roman Empire. However, the very first law that Constantine enacted after becoming the leader, the emperor, was to grant exception to the Christians of his part of the Roman Empire, Spain, France, and British Isles, from having to sacrifice to the emperor. This had been used in the past against Christians for persecution. And so somehow this is how when we piece it together, the history, we can figure out that this is probably due to his mother's influence, because he really wouldn't have had this way of, this kind of an opinion toward Christians. Now, Constantine, as all the Romans, was also very superstitious. And so he had at this time his deities which protected him. And he had his lucky charms and everything that he would take with him into battle. The idols that were protectors of his troops. And one of these, and you can see right here at the end, was the sun. And he chose the sun, and it appears on coins that were issued during Constantine's reign. Now I have I'll share with you about a little bit of history. Comes in a Ziploc bag, so it's not that important. But just last week, I was lucky enough to purchase a coin that was minted by the Roman Mint in about the year 312. And they can be identified pretty accurately because of little details on them. This actually comes from Syria. So the Roman Empire had quite an expanse. At this point, Constantine was no longer just the ruler over a small part of the emperor. He was a co-ruler. There were no longer 4, but it had come down to 2. And so here on this coin, you can see on one side is a young Constantine. Resembles a little bit the face that we saw earlier from that statue. And on the other side is an image of the sun god, Helios, which is, of course, the protector that he took on for his reign. This is the dark. It's dark because this is actually made out of bronze. This is not a. That's also why I could afford it, because otherwise this would not be affordable. But you can pass it around. I'll actually let you touch it. This is 1,700 years old. Next.
What's in that question?
Oh, it wasn't that bad. It was not painful. The bronze coins are, when it comes to Constantine's period, so of course he's one of the most popular rulers when it comes to purchasing coins. However, his coins that are from the legalization of Christianity on, so after the year 313, when there are already Christian symbols on it, those are the coins that are not in my price range. So this is still considered from the pagan period, so it's not as desirable. But nonetheless, for me, I mean, it's Constantine. It's still from his time. Well, Constantine, eventually, the tensions between him and Maximian, who was the son of the other senior emperor, Diocletian's partner, eventually their desire to be the main in this setup, they didn't necessarily want to be sole Roman emperor, but they wanted to be co-emperors, but the problem was who was going to be the first one, because the first one had the right to override the other. And so eventually this came to a head, and it led both the troops of both of these co-emperors to outside the city of Rome, where they would face off. They set up camp there, and there are a couple tellings of the story of how it happened. One of the stories that is told by Eusebius of Caesarea. He wrote a book called The Church History. And he was a contemporary of Constantine. He lived at the same time and a little bit into the 4th century, into the mid-4th century. And he claims that he heard this story from the mouth of Constantine himself when he wrote his book. And the story goes that Constantine, when he was riding towards the city of Rome, he looked towards the sun, because the sun was his protector. And he looked towards the sun in the hopes that the sun and the sun god, Helios, would continue to protect him as he became the #1 emperor in the empire. However, as he looked at the sun, he realized that there were other things happening there. And he saw that the sun was obscured by some sort of other image that was superimposed on it. And next to the sun, he saw a number of Greek words. And the Greek words, translated roughly, said, "In this sign you will conquer." And when he looked again at the sun, he saw the sun, we're not exactly sure, it's called a staurogram. Stavros is cross, so it's like a cross-like design. And some of the stories from that period say that the design was actually like this one. It was an X. And some say it was actually like a cross. If it was the X, so then it's the first letter of the name Christ, Christos. And of course, if it was the cross, and it's obvious allusion to the cross. Constantine, though, being superstitious, as soon as he stopped close to the city of Rome, he ordered that the symbol be put on all of the cavalry, all of the shields, all of the banners, that it be painted on. Because he thought that perhaps it was a symbol that was being revealed to him by the sun god. That's one of the stories. Another story says that he actually, when he was at the camp, he had a vision. And in this vision he saw the same, a symbol, and then he heard a voice that said, "In this symbol you will be victorious." Well, victory was indeed his. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in the year 312, Constantine conquered his opponent. And not only did he conquer his opponent, he became the sole emperor. His opponent was actually his brother-in-law. This is where the family ties get a little bit messy. His wife, Fausta, was the daughter of the senior emperor, and her brother became the junior emperor. Fausta was a little bit bitter. She was obviously not happy about this, and especially because after Constantine's victory, her brother somehow mysteriously drowned in the Tiber. He fell off the bridge, I guess. But, of course you kind of have to assume, well, it's a military thing. He may have accidentally been killed. Nonetheless, he was no longer an obstacle for Constantine. So Constantine becomes the sole emperor. Constantine, though, is baffled by this symbol, this sign. And so he begins a search to find out what the symbol is. Because if it's not from the sun god, then who is it from? And it is his mother who answers that question. Helena, having become a Christian, she realized from the story of Jesus that the cross was actually a reference to the cross of Christ. And it was difficult, though, for Constantine to find out what the symbol was, because firstly, Christians at that time did not use the cross as a symbol of their identity. The cross was a symbol that was from the time of the persecutions, and it had the allure of, well, the electric chair for us today. It was still being used by the Romans as a way of putting to death anyone who challenged their rule. And so the early Christians wouldn't have recognized that sign in and of themselves either. But Constantine's mother, she saw that this was the cross, and it was a direct reference to Christianity. And so Constantine begins this process, this journey towards Christian faith. In the year 313, in the city of Milan, and Milan was still the capital of that part of the Roman Empire. However, Constantine was already in his mind kind of projecting on how to rearrange the Roman Empire, because no longer did he want to deal with other treacherous political leaders who might turn on him eventually. And so he decides to change things a little bit. And in Milan, he legalizes Christianity in the year 313, making this the anniversary of that event. And he also begins a very extensive project of building, and specifically the building of churches. He goes to the city of Rome, and possibly because there is this, he probably wants to appeal to the Romans. The Romans were, after all, that was the capital city. And the Romans who were there from these noble families and ancient families, he needed their support to become the sole Roman emperor. And so he begins this campaign of building of churches, aided by his mother. And he begins, the first church that he begins to build is the Basilica of St. John on the Lateran Hill. And this basilica is still standing in the city of Rome. And it is a church that is considered the mother church of Rome. It is the cathedral, the seat of the bishop. Next to the basilica was a palace that belonged to Constantine, and Constantine gave that palace to the Pope to use as his seat. He also began, this was the basilica on the Lateran Hill was completed around the year 317, 318. He also built the first basilica of St. Peter's, which has nothing to do with the basilica we see today. What we see today is all Michelangelo. It's all a very different basilica from what Constantine had built. And Constantine also built the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, where St. Paul was buried. He also built many other churches, but he also sent his mother with a very generous allowance to travel to the Middle East, to the Holy Land, and to find the sites that were important to Christianity, places associated with the life of Jesus. And so Helena, coming to the Holy Land around the year 320, she begins this process of finding places that were preserved in the memory of the locals. The local Christians, many of them were descendants of the earliest Christians. They were even related to some of the apostles. So even though they could not build a church on the spot, they remembered where it was that Jesus performed this miracle, or where Jesus was buried, or where Jesus was crucified. And in fact, the place where Jesus was crucified was the place where the Romans were still crucifying people up to that very day. And so Helena went with local assistance and the local bishop Epiphanios, and she went and she discovered these different places and then paid for basilicas, churches, to be built on these spots, in these places. And that includes the Basilica of the Resurrection in the city of Jerusalem, which still stands, although it's a little adapted, but it's still pretty much the original. And then the Basilica of the Nativity in the city of Bethlehem, which also stands. Many other smaller churches were also built by her, and churches and even a small monastery that was built on the island of Cyprus as she was traveling back from the Holy Land. Constantine, though, I guess we should try to get ahead on these two next. I forgot about synchronizing with this, so let's see what's here. Okay, we covered this. Next. Okay. Constantine was, well, there are a number of important things that Constantine did that I think are probably facts that we might not even be aware of. But one of the things that Constantine was known for, he was known as a lawgiver. And for the ancient Romans, that was an important designation because the law of the land dictated how people would live their life. One of Constantine's, actually a number of Constantine's laws had to do with sexual morality. For example, adultery was punishable by death. Now that's pretty harsh. I mean, it's for our standards especially, but Constantine was also trying to change the society. Because the Romans were kind of notorious for, wild parties and all, and there was a very well-established, prostitution and things like that. And so Constantine knew that these were things that were both not compatible with Christianity, but they were also things that were undermining, weakening the family structure in the Roman Empire, and especially in the city of Rome. And Constantine, though, himself, he was not at that time a Christian. So although he's passing legislation that is very much affirming of Christian values, he himself is still not a Christian. And but these laws pass, and so he sets up firstly these morality laws. Secondly, he establishes Sunday as a day of rest. He establishes Sunday as a day of worship for Christians. And he also established the formula that chooses the date for Easter, the first Sunday after the full moon following the vernal equinox. So, and these are things which, of course, we're still doing. I mean, Sunday is still the day of worship, day of rest. Easter is still established according to this formula. And, well, the laws are not quite the same, but anyway. What unfortunately, one of the things that happened, and this is where Constantine, we're not sure of his own conversion process, but at some point, he must have been considering becoming a Christian himself, because these laws are very big changes for the ancient Romans. And in the city of Rome itself, Constantine was not popular, because the ancient families, the political families that ruled the political scene, they did not like Christianity. They saw Christianity as a weak religion. They saw it as a poor religion. And they saw it as a religion that was founded in Judaism, and the Jews within the Roman Empire were not well liked and respected. And so the ancient Romans, of course, they didn't understand why Constantine was enamored with Christianity, and they also resented his mother greatly. In fact, Helena, who ended up being buried in Rome, she never wanted to go back to that city. She really did not like Rome. And so she avoided it at every cost. And Constantine continued to fight within the city of Rome, but he wasn't getting anywhere. And so as a part of his restructuring, and it was motivated by a couple of different things. Firstly, because the Romans, the real Romans, were so intransigent and they were so hard-hearted, he couldn't really see it going anywhere there to rule an empire where eventually someone was going to stab him in the back. He knew it. So he couldn't see staying there as an option. And secondly, he himself had suffered a great loss. Because his wife, Fausta, had, she was very bitter when her brother was killed. She also was a jealous woman who was not really looking for any other religious background. She was not going to become a Christian. She greatly disliked his son by Minervina, the son that he had from his previous relationship. His son, Crispus, was very popular. He was a bright, intelligent, attractive, military man. He was very much like his father. He was raised, a significant part of his life he spent with Helena. So he was raised in the same values that Constantine had received. And Crispus, everybody thought that he would be the successor. And Fausta, because she had other children with Constantine, she firstly wanted her children to be the ones who are legitimate heirs, where Crispus was not legitimate. And secondly, because she still harbored some ill will because of the death of her brother, so she arranged for Crispus to be killed. And so it was on a military campaign that he was killed under mysterious circumstances that eventually Fausta was connected to. The mysterious circumstances, ironically enough, were adultery. And it was a completely trumped up, fabricated charge against him. And a number of women had testified against him that he had somehow led them down the road of perdition. And he ended up becoming a victim of Constantine's law. Before Constantine could intervene, it all happened far away from the city of Rome. So Constantine and Helena were, of course, devastated by this loss. And eventually Fausta was found to be, well, somehow involved. And so Fausta herself, this is where Constantine's not so Christian behavior comes out. Somehow Fausta takes a bath and gets kind of boiled in the bath. So, a little bit too hot that tub. So, and this is of course typical Roman stuff. Again, great movie. This is really made it. But with all of this happening, and this is back, I think Constantine himself, in seeing this and even having to participate in this, because he obviously would have known if someone was going to get rid of his wife, and so he found himself under duress in a situation where he was trying to change things, change Roman society, change the city of Rome, give the empire a new life, and it just wasn't working out. And it was beginning to change him. He who had these ideals, who upheld Christian values, was all of a sudden becoming party to old Roman-style intrigue. And so he decides to create a co-capital. Instead of making a co-emperor, he's going to make two capitals for the city for the Roman Empire. And the other city would be a completely new city, not taking any pre-existing town, not building on something that was established earlier. And so he chooses a site that is considered the border between Asia and Europe. And it is a city that is built kind of on a triangular peninsula. And it was just a small fishing town called Byzantine. And it was there that he chose to build another city. And it would be very practical because the city was protected by water on two sides, and the third side could be walled off very conveniently. It was also not directly on the Mediterranean, but it was on the Bosphorus Sea that flowed out into the Mediterranean. So great ships could make it all the way to the city. But armies of ships trying to invade the city would have a more difficult time making it up the narrow straits of the Bosphorus. And so Constantine in the year 324 establishes this new city that was going to be a Christian city. And because he is a modest man, he named it after himself.
Yeah.
Oh well, not quite the Christian thing to do. Okay, next. Well, Constantine's mother also ends up moving to the city of Constantinople, even though later on she is buried in Rome. In the city of Constantinople, Constantine begins a whole process of the building up of the city, including the calling of the First Ecumenical Council. In the year 325, Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea. Nicaea is a city that is not too far from Constantinople itself. And one of the dominant problems of Christianity at that time was that after 300 years of Christianity being lived on the run and in the underground, when local churches and bishops and leaders came out of the underground and began to share their faith and teach their faith, they found out that not everyone believed the same thing. And some of the beliefs about who Jesus was were also dramatically different. And so Constantine, instead of watching all the fighting going on in Christianity as people try to figure out what's what and who's who and what it all means, he decides to call the first ecumenical council with bishops from all around the Mediterranean world to come to the city of Nicaea, where they would gather, and there they would discuss the truths of the faith, creating a list of what we believe as Christians. And what they gave us at Nicaea is the creed that we pray at every liturgy. The creed was still tweaked a little bit, and in the year 381, so after Constantine, it was came final form in the form that we have it today. However, most of the work was done at Nicaea. At Nicaea also, there were other issues. There was the issue of Arianism, and Arianism was a belief that there was not an equality between Jesus and God the Father. And Jesus was actually a created being as opposed to being the pre-eternal God. Arianism was one of those underground currents in Christianity. And it was something that also needed to be, dealt with in a way that the fathers could deal with it. And the story goes, for example, one of the stories from the Council of Nicaea is that Arius stood up and spoke to the bishops. He addressed the bishops from the whole world. And as he spoke, he was a very effective and gifted speaker, and he began to expound his truth about Christ. And as he spoke, some of the bishops began to nod because they understood what he was saying and it made sense. And they began to come kind of to his side. There was a bishop, a small, aged bishop, who was also present at the council, and he knew that Arius was wrong. And this bishop listened, and as he watched and looked around himself and saw these other bishops who were beginning to come to Arius' side, he became greatly angered. And he saw that there was going to be a danger if he was to continue speaking. And so this bishop got up, walked up to Arius, and punched him in the face. This bishop is St. Nicholas. You thought that? That's the Nicholas I like. Santa Claus stuff. But it was, yes.
Is that where the Aryan nation, that group comes from now, or that has nothing to do with it?
That has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
They may want to make some connection, but it's not. Arianism is completely tied to a priest whose name was Arius.
Okay.
And so it usually takes the heresy takes the name of the founder of it.
Okay. And so was he expelled from the Catholic Church because of these thoughts?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
All his stuff was burnt.
Oh.
But what was funny was because they were trying to figure this out in a democratic way.
Yes.
So the Constantine was trying to keep a balance, so that it's like, okay, come on, we can't have bishops hitting bishops, and this kind of stuff shouldn't be happening. And so he banished Nicholas from the council. He said, well, you can't play by the rules, so get out of here. And so he took away his right to vote at the council. And, in some stories they say that he was actually imprisoned because of that kind of a rowdy behavior. And during the night, so Constantine had a vision. And the vision was Mary coming to Constantine, and she was holding the bishop's omophorium, what he wears on his shoulders. She was holding that, and then he saw Nicholas, and Mary went and she put the omophorium on Nicholas's shoulders. And that was the sign that was worn by the bishops as a sign of their authority as bishop. And so the next day, Constantine reinstated Nicholas back to the council. And the rest is history, so they say. And that's why you'll see, if you look at some of the icons of St. Nicholas, you'll see that he has Jesus on one side and Mary on the other, and Mary is holding an omophorium. That's from that vision. Now, this was, Constantine did also at this council, all of the decisions that he had unilaterally taken, such as the establishing of the date for Easter, such as the changing to Sunday as the day of worship and rest. All of these things were further emphasized and approved by the Council of Nicaea. They established, it would be wrong to say, well, everything was peaceful and fine and dandy after that. There were still a lot of issues. And a lot of the bishops, when they returned back to their sees, they found that, they had within their dioceses groups that did not agree with the decisions of the Council of Nicaea. And so there was quite a bit of persecution of some of these religious minorities that had different Christianish beliefs. And there were also present in the empire at the same time some groups that had mixed beliefs. For example, we hear about the Gnostic Gospels, Gnosticism. And the Gnostics were a combination of Christianity with ancient Egyptian religion. Their beliefs were also very strange in many ways, because they believed that Jesus was not actually incarnate as a human being, but rather that he appeared to be a human being, but was rather a spiritual being. And they believed that the human body is evil, and that it was created by the devil. And then they had, related to that, they also had there was no marriage, there was a lot of sex. It's a very weird way of living a religion. But they were a real mess. And they're one example of many throughout the Roman Empire of these kinds of emerging of Christianity with the local religions, the ancient religions. And the Council of Nicaea begins this process of normalization, where all Christians can pretty much believe the same thing. They have a set of core beliefs and values, and that it's, although we pray the creed, and we say it's not really a prayer if you think about it, it's more of like the Declaration of Independence. We just have a list of different things. But it sets up that which is correct against that which is false. And it begins the process. And really that's why Constantine is given so much credit in the Eastern churches, specifically the Byzantine churches, Orthodox and Catholic. So Constantine is recognized as equal to the apostles. Even though, admittedly, going through his history, it's a colorful history. There are, of course, the intrigues of the Roman Empire, but there is also some genuine spiritual movement in this man, because we don't have, he didn't write his autobiography. We can kind of piece together historical documents that speak about him. But one of the things that most historians will agree is that the things that Constantine did, the small things, speak to some of his core values. Because if he just wanted to use Christianity as a new religion so that he could control the Roman Empire, then he wouldn't try to change a lot of the things that were so Roman about the Roman Empire. Things such as, the adultery laws, sexual mores and customs. And he was very proactive in what he did. And it speaks to I think what was the conversion going on in his own life. When his mother died in the year, she died on May 22nd, or rather August 18th in the year 330. She was buried outside of the city of Rome, and her sarcophagus is in the Vatican Museum of all places. Well, because as a saint, when she was canonized, so of course her body went to other places, and so the big old Roman porphyry sarcophagus, which is as big as a garage, you could park a car in it. That became associated more with her past, because it was not really a Christian tomb, but rather it seemed as it was more of a befitting an empress. And of course, by the time she died, she was buried as Flavia Julia Helena Augusta. So, she grew a whole bunch of other names too. So it's like, this was typical, of course, because she was very well respected. She was very loved also, from what we can tell from the stories that are recorded about her, especially from like the ecclesiastical church history by Eusebius. We can see a woman who was truly moved by her Christian faith. She was known to go and feed the hungry in the streets. She was known to give her clothes to the less fortunate. And when she was in the Holy Land or Rome or Constantinople, she never sat in the places that were reserved for the royal family. She went and she dressed simply, and she just went in with the crowd. And of course she was recognized. She didn't run from that either. She stayed there with them. And so she was a woman, she was a simple woman who was from the country, and she stayed of the people. And she was really motivated by her faith. She took her home in Rome, and she gave it to the Pope. And the Pope went and he turned that into a church. That's the Church of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, which is in the city of Rome. And Constantine himself, though, and when she died, he was still not a Christian. And possibly because of some of the political issues, possibly because he wasn't ready to become a Christian yet. But when he felt that death was drawing near, he asked to be baptized. Strangely enough, he got baptized by an Arian bishop, but it was still valid. It was still a Trinitarian baptism. Some people have assumed that perhaps since it was an Arian bishop who baptized him, that maybe he had sympathies that were more along the line of the Arians. We don't really know. But of course, that's a time when people were working through the theology. One of the things that he did do before his conversion, his baptism and death, in the year 331, he commissioned 50 Gospels. And this was the first time that the Gospels were brought together. It forced the church to consider very seriously what is a real gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, versus what are other texts, either fake gospels, heretical gospels, like the Gnostic gospels, or texts that are ancient and from the early church, but not of the same quality and caliber as the Gospels written by the evangelists. And so, commissioning in the year 331 these 50 texts was a monumental work, because not only, and this is where his genius is almost is evident, he wanted a unique format for these Gospels. And so he had them done on pages and bound in a book. Up until that time, books were not commonly used. That was not a format that was, firstly, they were very heavy, but secondly, it was just not practical. It was easier to have things done on scrolls and then stored in little pockets in a cupboard, and you could just put it in the scroll. Very easy, very simple. And then read it as you need. I mean, you'd spread the scroll out, and then roll it from one roll to the other as you read it. Very simple. But he wanted a different structure. He wanted something that was going to be unique. And so he created this book format that was exclusively for the Gospels. Today we know of, I guess, only two texts in the world that that we know of that are probably from that period, that were part of the 50. And one of them is the Codex Sinaiticus, and then another one is, don't remember what it's called, it's also got a fancy name. But it's, both of them are in the UK, in Great Britain. Preserved, and probably from what we can tell, from that period. Now these were enormous texts, big Gospels. And so when you see Father Miron carrying the Gospel in the procession, and you can imagine what that was, in Constantinople and Hagia Sophia, where the carrying of the Gospel was not some small text that, weighs a couple of pounds, but rather it was something that involved deacons carrying a large text that, they had to share equally the load. And then on top of that text, as Constantine did, was the cross. Because that was one of the other things that Constantine did. He made the cross the common symbol of Christianity. And what he did, the first thing that he did, was to illegalize crucifixions. So crucifixions were stopped. And then secondly, he took the cross, and his mother, of course, brought back pieces of the true cross. But the other thing that he did was he took these pieces and he put them into beautifully made gold and silver and jeweled crosses. So they, where we say, I know that, when we wear a cross or when we get a cross, so, you can go for like a simple wooden cross, but, isn't it nicer when it's made out of gold, or has jewels in it, or, is more decorative? Well, that actually started with Constantine, because he struggled with trying to convince Christians to accept the cross as a symbol of Christ and of resurrection, because it was something that was so traumatic, and indeed was something that most Christians would have actually shied away from, because it was awkward. It did not make sense to have that.
How would he have overcome that? I mean, if you think about it today, if somebody came in and told us, from now on, our symbol of faith is the electric chair, how do you overcome that?
Well, I think the first thing was by illegalizing it. When it became a practice that was less common, that was the first most important step. Secondly, the cross as it was recognized by Christians was not the same cross that we recognize. If you remember in the different movies about the Passion of Christ, but you take like Jesus of Nazareth. So we see that Jesus is carrying a beam. He's actually not walking with the cross, like when you see the Stations of the Cross, so you see him carrying a cross. That's not the way it was. What the Romans did was they chose a spot for these executions, or spots in some cases, and they would take an enormous beam of the hardest, most durable wood, and they would plant it firmly and deeply into the ground. And that beam stayed standing for hundreds of years. And it was on that beam that was used for crucifixion. The person would then come carrying the beam. The idea was to tire the person out so much that death would be easier, although not quick, but easier. And then at that point, the person would be firmly tied to the beam, the arms outstanded, and raised up so that eventually the lungs would collapse, or nailed to the cross. Once that was set up, then it was done like a pulley system. He would be pulled up over the cross and taken up to the appropriate height. And then there would be put like a footrest to which the feet would also be nailed. I mean, it was a very well thought out mode of execution. But for the Christians, they didn't see it in they saw it as segmented pieces. You know, probably just seeing that beam of that tree that was basically the trunk of an enormous tree that had been brought from somewhere. Just seeing that was a reminder of the cross. And
so those beams were just stayed there all the time. And then as people were crucified, it's just the cross, the horizontal part of that was raised up on.
Yeah.
So the cross was more like an L.
It could have been in some places. We know with Jesus it wasn't, because it says that the charge was on. Yeah. So, and the one in Jerusalem was also a particularly big one. Because I guess where they would have smaller trees if they didn't have access to large trees. But I mean, this could have been like a cedar brought from Lebanon. I mean, these were massive trees that, lived for hundreds of years. And the wood, once it dried, it was good for hundreds of years. So, what Helena found was a mess of wood, because they recycled a lot of the beams, so this way. That was another thing, we're told that she found, a mountain of wood, so then they picked through that to figure out, well, which one of these is associated with Jesus. And so the story goes that when she located the piece of wood that was from Jesus's cross, they took that piece of wood and they touched the body of a person who had just died, and the person woke up. And so that's how they were able to tell which piece it was. But it was, of course, it was I think for Constantine, by creating a symbol, and he first started out with a cross that was, both beams were the same size. So it was what we would call a Greek cross, or if you're familiar, the cross of Jerusalem. So without the four little crosses, but just the central cross. It was not as recognizable to the Christians as some other, if he had come up with some other crosses. But and also then the dressing up, to put it into gold and silver, that made it much more of a symbol that could be accepted by people. not just the Christians, but also many of the pagans who found, that they found the cross to be more attractive. And with the passing of time, as crucifixion was no longer practiced, so it became very abstract. I mean, think of us, we don't necessarily associate too much with the guillotine. It's kind of far removed. I mean, yeah, it's horrible and everything if you really think about it a lot. But it's not as jarring as, electric chair. That's a whole different reality because it's still being used. It's all of a sudden so much more realistic for us. But Constantine, one of the reasons that Constantine is a saint is because he also understood, and this is the basic teaching of the church, that the sacrament, the mystery of baptism, takes away all sins. And so he obviously got his sinfulness out of the way, went through his life and did what he had to do as both a political leader as well as a military man. And when he was finally baptized, he knew that with baptism, all of that would be washed away, all of that would be forgiven. And so the church recognizes him as a saint also for that reason, because he really did get it. I mean, it's a little dramatic in how the story runs, but it does show a very clear understanding of the basic premise and theology of baptism. And Constantine, finally when he passed away, so he was known as Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantinus Augustus. And he passed away on May 22nd in the year 337. He died in the city of Constantinople, and he was buried there. He had built a mausoleum, a church for himself. Let's see.
What year was the cross?
Here, this is the church that Constantine had built for himself. It was a church built with 5 domes. The church unfortunately does not survive. It was destroyed by the Turks. And so all we have this is a 12th century manuscript. But, and Constantine's body was also disappeared. We're not sure where it is, although there's some relic somewhere, so.
Well, his mother died in 331.
330.
330. And then she was responsible for being there when they discovered the cross.
Yep.
What year was that?
That was around the year 327, 28. And if you look at the icon, in September we celebrate the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. So you see there is at the bottom is a lady dressed up with a crown, and that's St. Helena. And then there's a bishop who is carrying the cross, and then St. Epiphanius, who was the bishop of Jerusalem at the time. Can we see the other?
I have a question.
Yes.
I think it's so unusual that they were able to pinpoint the month and the day of the month, way back in 1937.
Well, not really, because if you think about it, the words that we use for the months are all Roman.
I mean, it just seems so unusual that happened so long ago.
Remember the Ides of March?
Yeah.
Guess what? It's still March. We use the same things. They did record everything. The Romans were very well organized, and so the only problems that we have been where there have been calendar jumps. So, for example, when we switched from the Julian reckoning to the Gregorian reckoning, so we lost a week there. And so those things have some influence over figuring out, is May 22nd when we celebrate, is that the actual same anniversary date or not? Probably not, because there are discrepancies. The calendar has been adjusted a couple of times to make up. I mean, that's the whole thing with leap year, and all of that was done to help us figure out a regular cycle, since, you know, the 24-hour period is not the most perfect way of reckoning time. Yes?
You said that Constantine was the single emperor. Were there junior emperors still when he was reigning, or did he get rid of that?
No, the last one was Fausta's brother.
Oh,
He was, because the two of them were junior emperors.
okay.
Like Constantinus Chlorus, his father was, at one time he was the junior emperor. Eventually he became the senior emperor. And so they moved up. I mean, it was a kind of a strange arrangement. And it was, you could say, historically it was doomed from the get-go, because it couldn't work out with that kind of a military background, and also all the bad history. There's, no matter how close they were on the battleground as military leaders who may have worked together and organized campaigns together, when they go and they become political leaders, it's not the same world. And, although you may have each other's back when you're out fighting the enemy, when you go back and you have to deal with political parties and families and money, and there are problems. And so
then when he died, was there an emperor that succeeded him?
like Constantine, yes, his children. And the line continued, his line continued for about 100 years. And they had different problems, and one of his sons was not really Christian. One of his grandsons tried to make the empire, the Roman Empire, pagan again. So it didn't work out all the kinks, but it's a history that is very interesting. However, what Constantine and Helena did, I don't think we can doubt that their motivation was authentic. I mean, there was really faith that was moving these people, because the world was against them. And, up to his death, Constantine had fear that he would be assassinated at one point or another. And many of the people that he had brought with him to Constantinople, not many, but some of the people they had agreed to work with Constantine in his new capital, but they also did not convert to Christianity. They thought that this was just some phase and that it would go back. And we see that. The writings of the fathers show a lot of that tension, that there was still, and that's why the fathers of the church, for example, in this period, are very anti-idolatry. And even when Christians wanted to have statues or paintings, so the fathers were like, no way, none of that, because they were worried that they were always a breath away from going back to paganism. And so, and some of the statues, I mean, they were basically taking statues that were of Diana or Athena, and then it was all of a sudden it was Mary, and the father was like, that's not the way it is. And so those kinds of tensions were real and lasted for a long time. You think about even St. John Chrysostom in the 5th century. He comes across a little heavy-handed in his sermons, especially in the ones that are called against the Jews. So it really makes it sound kind of polemical right there. But the issue was that he had a large community of Jewish Christians who were flip-flopping. And so they were not celebrating, they weren't truly Christians, and they weren't truly Jewish. And so, that they were also causing problems among his flock, because they were confusing people. They were saying, because of course they were right. They knew the scriptures, they knew the Old Testament, and they would say, well, Jesus was Jewish, and people didn't know how to answer that when they were coming from a Greek background or another background that was not Jewish. So the tensions were were great, and there were many things that the early church had to deal with. And, and it's a part of history that is very exciting too, because in the midst of all of this, Constantine is building churches. There is in Egypt, monasticism is beginning. The first monks and nuns are going off into the desert because they all admire the martyrs, the ones who gave their life and spilt their blood for their faith in Christ, but that was no longer a reality. All the martyrs were in the past. And so the monks and the nuns were dying to this life in a different way by leaving behind the comforts of home and family and moving into the desert and living in caves or in small communities where it was hostile, not comfortable, but they dedicated their lives to praying. So it's an exciting time for the church. In the midst of, lest you think that it's all negative and fighting, it's not. I mean, they were trying to figure out some of the basic beliefs that we use today to define our Christian faith. And, the role that Constantine also set up. Constantine, although he was not a Christian until the very end of his life, he is given much credit because obviously he was educated in Christianity. And he set the model. All of the Byzantine emperors after him were educated at the court of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So they were all theologians. Many of them were better theologians than some of the bishops and patriarchs. And because Constantinople was the co-capital, Rome did not cease to be the capital. Rome just wasn't getting as much money as Constantinople. That ultimately, the people who were in with the emperor, they went to Constantinople, but both cities were equally capitals of the empire. And so, because of all that money and power, anyone who was a theologian would be at some point either invited to Constantinople or their writings, their sermons would be brought to Constantinople and then copied and written and sent out. And so the emperors, they all had wonderful theological background, and all of the universal councils, so the 7 ecumenical councils that are common between the Eastern churches and the Western church, those councils were all called by emperors. Not a single one was called by a patriarch or a pope. And that was because usually the patriarchs and the popes and other bishops were all fighting. And so it was the emperor who was like, okay, we got to have another one of these sit down, come to Jesus meetings, they're calling an ecumenical council, and clarify these positions, define it. And, some of the emperors, when you read about the councils, you can go to the icons and see beautiful images of bishops all sitting there angelically, and they're beautiful icons, yes. But, the reality was that, some of these councils happened under great duress. And one of the councils, I don't remember which one, but it was one of the later councils in the 6th century or 7th century. The emperor actually withheld food from the bishops because they were fighting so much and were so stubborn. He said, well, there's only water. And believe it or not, they came to a decision miraculously. And that's the good stuff that you don't see in the icons. So it's like, but it is, the history of the church is about the human experience of Christianity. It's not about God just dumping this, story, the gospel in front of us, and here it is. There's such an exciting story to it in the way that it has both challenged history and nations, civilizations even, and then how it's become a part of the history, how it's fashioned our human history. You think about things like, where Sunday comes from, where books come from. I mean, it's a remarkable thing to realize. And even something simple as the cross you put around your neck. And it has a story, and that story not only gives us our identity as Christians, defines who we are, but it also connects us to our history. So that it's something that, we become bearing a treasure that is not just from our grandparents or from our ancestors who came to this country, but rather it's something that has been passed down from Jesus himself, through the apostles to the church. So, any other questions? Yes?
I have a statue of St. Nicholas, and he's carrying a pine tree. Is there any connection between the pine tree?
Pine tree. I wonder if that's not somewhat. That might be one of the German legends. There are a number of legends that are associated with Nicholas. Nicholas was buried in Myra in Asia Minor. And when his body was taken, of course, it depends who you're talking to. So the Italians will say that they assisted in translating his body and carrying it. It's safe passage from the tomb that they ripped it out of all the way to southern Italy. So it was, but he was very popular in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. But he was a local saint. The Italians, and especially the people from Bari, because they were merchants, they were familiar with his story. And one of the things in Italy was that any of these towns, they got more money according to what commerce or what business they were in, agriculture, winemaking, olives, or merchants. Well, the city of Bari was making quite a bit of money. And so they were building, beautiful public buildings and churches, and it was a secure city. But any good city in Italy, all in Christendom, I guess, at that time, any good city has to have its own saint. If you don't have your saint, well then, it doesn't really matter. And so they went and they got their own saint. And so they brought back St. Nicholas. And St. Nicholas, a part of his relics found their way up to Germany. And it's in the city of Worms in Germany, is the first chapel dedicated to St. Nicholas in Europe, outside of what would be Eastern Christian lands. So Greece and that area, they of course venerated him prior to that. But in Western Christian lands, that was the first actual church that was dedicated to him. And it was dedicated in the year 1081. And with that, because they didn't know who he was, this was kind of the other part of it. As the Baresi are trying to kind of build up their fame, we have our own saint, Saint Nicholas, and people were like, who's that? They never heard of him. So because of that, they had to translate his life, his story, from Greek into Latin and then into local languages. And then they also enhanced it with other stories. And so I suspect, I don't know about any pine tree story, not from Asia Minor.
Well, it looks like a Christmas tree, but I just figured...
That's what I suspect that has that connection. Especially, he was very popular in Germany. St. Nicholas was one of Martin Luther's least favorite persons. Because St. Nicholas was so popular in Germany. And so when Martin Luther was trying to focus people away from veneration of saints and focus more on Jesus, and he had a good idea. he really needed to hurt St. Nicholas. And so he tried very hard. Well, that's where he started, Martin Luther started the tradition that gifts were brought by the Christ child and not by St. Nicholas. God bless you. Gift giving was not associated at that time with Christmas. Gift giving was not associated with Christmas. There were two holidays in the 12th, 13th century that were holiday gift giving times. That was St. Nicholas. He would bring gifts for the children, and the three kings. And those were the gift giving days. And it was kind of like beginning of the Christmas season, end of the Christmas season. And so Martin Luther took away and it used to be, St. Nicholas would come on a horse. And I've seen it in parts of Germany, it's still that way. I was in Germany for St. Nicholas a couple of years ago, and believe it or not, there was St. Nicholas riding on a horse through the town. That was something that was normal. Well, he changed it, and he made it the Christ child who would be riding on a horse, and he took on some of the same things. And in German, this is where the stories get very interesting. In German, Christ child is Christkindl. What does that sound like? You got it. So it's a lot of the histories, they kind of flow into each other. And so this was, the Kris Kringle came about with the Knickerbocker Tales, which were written in a very Dutch-influenced New York City in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So there was still a lot of that Protestant background, German-speaking Protestant background. And so it got into that too, because of course, that St. Nicholas was still secretly popular. But they called him the Christ child, just in case Martin Luther was still around.
Just have one quick question.
Yes.
The oil that Father got from, he got it from Rome, correct? Is that from St. Nicholas?
It's from Bari.
Oh, it actually is from Bari. Now, was that just oil that was touched to a relic of Saint?
No, there has been a long history with St. Nicholas, even prior to his transference to Italy, where his bones exude an oil. Oh. And it's a kind of an oil that is very thick, so it's not like olive oil. And what is done now, every year, the Dominican fathers who are in charge of the Basilica of St. Nicholas, they will take from the box, the bones are in a box, which has holes underneath it, so if there is any oil that comes out, it'll drip out. And they'll take that, and they call it manna. And they will mix whatever comes out, because some years are very light, and some years are heavier. And so they'll take that and they will mix that with a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of holy water, and then send that out.
So his bones have been exuding this oil ever since he died?
Yep, ever since, yeah. It's recorded as far back as the 6th century, so early 500s is when they first started noticing that. So St. Nicholas is, of course, your patron saint here. Very, very popular saint, not just today, but really from the very beginning. And he's right there in, that time of Constantine, at the Council of Nicaea, the Creed. And he was not some prolific writer. A lot of the church fathers, you take Cyril of Alexandria, Athanasius, John Chrysostom, Basil the Great, they wrote When they preached, everything they said was written down so that it would be preserved for generations. And even like Basil the Great, so even the letters that he wrote to his friends are saved because they're so beautifully poetic and very Christian. And so Nicholas didn't write, apparently, at least we don't have anything of his. Nicholas was not known as some incredible preacher, because that would have been, with all the other things that are said about him, that would have definitely been preserved. He was well known because he was a real pastor of his little town. As bishop, he knew the people. And even though there were many people who were trying to either obscure what was going on in their life, they had, some scandals going on, they were running out of money and they needed help, they didn't tell other people because it was embarrassing, to have other people know that. Somehow he always knew. And so he would go and then he would help them. And they didn't know who did this. But eventually, when he died, they found out who it was. And so, the stories went on because it was like, okay, after the time of the martyrs, where you have these superheroes that you pointed to, and then you have the monks. This period, Constantine's period, is really a period that is most focused on the bishops. And you have the bishops who did the explaining of the faith, like St. Athanasius or St. Cyril of Alexandria was later on became bishop, but he was a deacon at Nicaea. And so he is, some of his terminology, which he uses in his writings, is actually echoes the creed. So people even think that maybe he had to do with that. So we have these different bishops who taught the faith, who explained things. And explained it in a way that it had never been explained before. That's also part of the reason why there was so much conflict, because not everyone believed the same. But Nicholas was, he was just good. In a time when you have all these bishops who are great theologians, there is something to be said about just being a good bishop, doing what you have to do to lead people to God, and setting up the diocese in a way that it could serve the people, because he took care of the orphans, he took care of the widows, and he knew his people. He was not removed and living in a nice house somewhere close to the cathedral, but he was right there among them. And then, of course, and I find this just really cool, is, he also punched Arius in the face. Gee, that is awesome. It's like, that takes conviction. So it's, this is not just some nice guy. It's like, I know from I didn't take theology for so many years to not understand that, when you ask the question, what would Jesus do? It would probably not be punch Arius in the face. But as an experience, as seeing that humanity, of like faith that is not just lived in, the icon surrounded by angels and gold, but is rather something that he was so passionate about when he saw Arius misleading people and convincing them by his trickery and speech. It moved him enough to make him shut up. That's great.